Tánaiste, I've run out of words to describe the horror unfolding in Gaza and now Lebanon. This week, I and millions of other people watched a young man in a hospital tent burn alive. He was still attached to an IV drip, reaching out his hand for help. The Israeli army had targeted a missile strike on tents on the grounds of Al-Aqsa Hospital. Not content with destroying all the hospitals in Gaza, they're now bombing the ruins. The name of the man who died was Shaban al-Dáil. He was 19 years old and a computer engineer student. Shaban was sheltering in a tent on the hospital grounds with his parents and his 5 siblings. He had been there for some time. In February, in a social media video, he said his family had been displaced 5 times. He'd been trying to leave Gaza and reach safety. On his GoFundMe page, he wrote, "I used to have big dreams, but the war has ruined them. Time feels like it stopped in Gaza and we're stuck in a never-ending nightmare." Tánaiste, Shaban is just one of more than 40,000 people in Gaza who've been slaughtered. His mother also burned alive. I name him here today because we don't hear the names or see the faces of the victims in Gaza. Every single one of those more than 40,000 people had a life, had a family, had hopes and dreams. But they've been massacred in a glorified prison camp for more than 12 months while the world sits idly by. Journalists in Gaza who've been documenting this genocide have been targeted and killed too, to stop them broadcasting Israel's war crimes to the world. How can we watch this massacre every single day and not do more? The Israeli state has lost any pretense of morality or proportionality. It's a rogue state which is attempting to plunge the whole region into war. And this government, which talks tough on Israel, has yet to apply any actual sanctions. Our economic, diplomatic and travel relationship with Israel is virtually unchanged. We now learn the government is finally going to move on the Occupied Territories Bill because the legal advice is that the ICJ ruling in the summer has changed things. Tánaiste, illegal Israeli settlements were a breach of international law when the Occupied Territories Bill was drafted in 2018. The genocide unfolding on Gaza was a breach of international law last year. We didn't need the ICJ ruling to act. The ruling just means that you've now run out of excuses for inaction. With an election imminent, you've almost run out of time to do anything. Tánaiste, everyone in this House will cooperate to get the Occupied Territories Bill enacted. It seems like the election will be in a matter of weeks. What is being done to get this over the line before then?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say that what is happening in Gaza, what is happening in the West Bank, and what is happening in the Lebanon is absolutely unacceptable. It's clearly in breach of international humanitarian law. And in terms of what happened in northern Gaza in the last week, in my view, we witnessed war crimes of a shocking nature taking place. And I immediately called out that in a statement in respect of what was happening in northern Gaza and followed that up at the Foreign Affairs Council earlier this week on Monday, when I really had to say to some of my colleagues around the table that Europe, the European Union, needed to do far more in respect of the horrific murder, slaughter that is going on in Gaza and the collective punishment of an entire people. Now, I would disagree with the Deputy sort of saying this government hasn't done anything. I don't like that rhetoric or propaganda, well, sorry, that sort of partisanship in terms of this debate, an almost holier-than-thou attitude from the opposition vis-à-vis the government. There is a collective view in this House in terms of what should happen here. There should be an immediate ceasefire. There should be a release of all hostages. The holding of hostages for a full year by Hamas is equally heinous and shouldn't be tolerated. And there should be an immediate surge of humanitarian aid. Now, Ireland was one of the first countries to defend UNRWA, which is the most practical thing we can do for the people of Gaza, the people of West Bank, the people of the Palestinians in Jordan, Palestinians in Lebanon. Despite all the rhetoric and do this and do that, the most significant thing we've done actually in this was to stand up and say, stop undermining UNRWA, and to say to our European Union colleagues, don't pull funding from UNRWA. And we did help to reverse that policy position which some were advocating, which the Commission, one Commissioner was advocating when he had pulled funds from UNRWA. And Philip Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, acknowledges that. That's one. We've also then, one of the few member states, along with Spain, to recognise the state of Palestine. Everybody in this House wanted that. As soon as we did it, of course, everybody in the House said, you're doing nothing. Well, that's done. Move on. But the reality is that created its own issues. But I think it is the right thing to do as part of the Arab peace plan. And everything we've been doing has been working with Arab nations who want peace. Jordan, Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Palestine itself. If you talk to the Palestinian Authority, they do not speak about the Irish government like you do. They genuinely don't. They say Ireland is giving very strong leadership. Now, on the question of the occupied territories, but the International Court of Justice's opinion does matter and does change the circumstances. And I can elaborate on that with you if you wish, and I have no issue in talking to you and other party leaders in respect of this, because for far too long we've had too much simplistic narrative about the Middle East. And we need to be very clear in terms of how we progress this, making sure that we can do it in an effective way, both politically and also legally.
Taoiseach, I know that the ICJ ruling on the illegal Israeli settlements was extremely important and very welcome, but I repeat that we didn't need it to act. I presume you agree with that, because am I right in thinking that Fianna Fáil put forward the bill in 2019? But because you did wait, we're now running out of time. I heard you on the Irish Times podcast, you said that we would have an election after critical pieces of legislation were passed. So does that mean that there's, what's going on in relation to this bill? Is there an army of lawyers in the AG's office and the Department of Finance working morning, noon and night to try to get the Occupied Territories Bill over the line? You've said that it needs amendments. Are they being drafted as we speak? Is this hugely important piece of legislation being prioritised? Or are we just going to get more words? There are other things we can do. At a bare minimum, stop the passage of weapons through Irish airspace. This is an issue that was first raised by the Ditch months ago. Last night, Minister Carol McNeill was on the Tonight Show. She said the government still isn't sure if any weapons were on board those flights. I don't know if she was serious. If the Ditch can find out, I don't know why the government can't. Months ago, you said you'd introduce travel bans for violent Israeli settlers. Even the United States, Israel's biggest cheerleaders, has managed to do that, Taoiseach. So you talk a lot about what you said, and you stood up and said no. What have you actually done? What actions, what sanctions?
But just in terms of the Occupied Territories Bill, there are aspects of it that are clearly unconstitutional, but they can be rectified and amended. Clearly unconstitutional as it's currently drafted. And in terms of, there was only a case 10 days ago, France versus the Commission in respect of the Western Sahara. Again, very clear similarities between that and the West Bank. And the ruling of that wasn't actually as favourable as we would have liked in terms of what we want to do here, in terms of ensuring that we can prohibit trade to the occupied territories. That's the target, that's the objective. I believe the ICJ gives us a pathway now that we didn't have, because trade is still an exclusive competency of the European Union Commission. That's the facts. But the ICJ, there is a public policy sort of exemption that one can potentially invoke. But in our view, the ICJ perhaps gives us the potential to invoke that narrow pathway to doing what everyone in the House agrees in terms of not having trade with the occupied territories, because the ICJ is now saying, and that's an authoritative statement of international humanitarian law. It's not binding, by the way, on all states, but it's an authoritative statement of international humanitarian law. It states, which we sponsored, by the way, we co-sponsored the resolution that led to the ICJ doing this. We made a written submission to it. The Attorney General made an oral submission to the ICJ on this issue, much of which was reflected in the subsequent judgment that the occupation was illegal and that states now had an obligation not to do anything that would support the occupation. So it is very significant in charting and enabling us, I think, to navigate a way forward now on this question.